The water was at his chest by the time Lewis Redmond understood he might die before he ever reached her. The creek had swollen into something monstrous, fed by 3 days of relentless October rain that turned the Red Bone Valley into a gray, churning wilderness. His horse, a reliable buckskin named Cutter, had balked at the bank and refused to enter no matter how hard Lewis dug in his heels. So Lewis had done what any man carrying a secret this heavy would do. He dismounted, tied Cutter to a cottonwood, and walked into the flood himself. The current hammered his ribs like a fist, his boots filled with mud and cold water that felt like January ice even though it was barely autumn. The badge on his chest, the 5-pointed star of Harlan County that he had worn for 11 years, caught the last orange light of the failing sun and threw it back at the clouds like a dare. He had to reach Inez Sutton. Not tomorrow, not at first light. Tonight, before the dark sealed itself over this valley like a coffin lid, because what he carried in his coat pocket was not information a man could sleep on, and what was coming for her from the direction of Hollowell Creek could not be outrun by dawn. He knew she would not believe him easily. She had every reason in the world not to trust Lewis Redmond. He had done enough, said enough, failed her enough in the months since she arrived in Caldwell Falls that her distrust was not paranoia. It was wisdom. And standing waist-deep in a creek that was trying its absolute hardest to drown him, he decided that if he got out the other side alive, he was going to lay down every last wall he had ever built and tell her the truth, all of it, the part about the letter he had not delivered, the part about the bargain he had struck with the man she feared most, and the part that had nothing to do with duty or danger at all. The part that had kept him awake on 400 consecutive nights since the very first afternoon she had walked into his county. The current grabbed his legs and pulled. Lewis dug his boots into the creek bed and pushed forward. He thought, with the strange clarity that near-death has a habit of producing, about the morning Inez Sutton had arrived in Caldwell Falls, Texas, in the spring of 1882. She had come on the southbound stage from Abilene, alone, wearing a dark green traveling dress that was dusty from 3 days of hard road, and a hat she kept tilting against the wind as if she intended to fight it personally. She was 26 years old, carrying one large trunk and a leather document case, and she had a letter in that case that named her the rightful owner of the Sutton Hill property northeast of town, 140 acres left to her by her father, Inez Sutton, who had died the previous winter of a heart that had been breaking for years. Lewis had been leaning against the post outside the sheriff's office when the stage rolled in, and he watched her climb down without waiting for the driver to offer his hand. She looked at the main street of Caldwell Falls, at its 2 saloons and its hardware store and its small white church, and she looked at it the way a person looks at a problem they intend to solve. Then she looked directly at Lewis as if she somehow already knew who he was, and she said, perfectly calm, perfectly clear, "I am looking for the sheriff." "You found him," Lewis said. "Good," she said. "Then you can tell me why Franklin Holt has been collecting rent on my father's property for the past 8 months when my father was the deed holder, and my father is dead." Lewis had felt the name Franklin Holt land in the air between them like a stone dropped into deep water, and he had watched the ripples go out and out and out. And in that moment he had known, with the instinct that 11 years of wearing a badge teaches a man, that this woman had just walked into the most dangerous county in West Texas carrying the most dangerous kind of weapon there is, which is a legitimate legal claim against a man who has never once in his life been stopped by anything legal. That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of Inez Sutton sleeping in a rented room at Clara Voss's boarding house, because Franklin Holt had already installed 2 of his hired men at the Sutton Hill property and refused to vacate. 6 months of legal papers filed with Judge Reinhold, who was 60 years old and frightened, and who found new reasons every month to delay hearing the case. 6 months of Lewis watching from a careful, cowardly distance, as Inez met every obstacle with a jaw set so firm, it looked like it had been cut from the limestone bluffs east of town. and 6 months of Lewis Redmond knowing things he had not told her. He had not told her that Franklin Holt had come to him privately 3 days after Inez arrived, and told him, with the precise, pleasant menace of a man who never raises his voice, that the sheriff of Harlan County had a future to consider, that there was an open federal position in El Paso that paid 3 times what the county paid, and that a certain territorial senator owed Franklin Holt a considerable number of favors. It would not be difficult, Holt had said, to see a man like Lewis Redmond rewarded appropriately, provided that man understood the value of patience and the wisdom of not accelerating certain legal proceedings. Lewis had not taken the offer. But he had not reported it either. He had told himself it was strategy, that he was gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for the right moment. He had told himself that for 6 months while Inez Sutton sat in a boarding house room and wrote letters to the state land office and read law books by lamplight and tried, alone, to take back what was hers. The creek rose to his shoulders. Lewis Redmond, who had faced a dozen gunfights without flinching, who had once tracked a murderer for 9 days through the Llano Estacado without sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch, was frightened. Not of the water. He was frightened of arriving at Inez Sutton's door and watching her face when he told her the truth. He pushed forward. The far bank was close, 15 feet, 10. His right boot found a submerged rock and he drove himself up and forward, and suddenly the water was at his waist again, then his thighs, then his knees, and he was on the bank, muddy and shaking, the cold already working its way into his bones, the western sky burning down its last red inch of light against the horizon. He had maybe 40 minutes before full dark. He started walking. The Sutton Hill property was 2 miles from the creek crossing, up a gentle slope through post oak and cedar that smelled of rain and wet earth, and Lewis walked it as fast as his soaked boots would carry him. He had left Cutter tied back at the bank, which meant he was on foot in terrain he knew well enough to navigate even as the shadows thickened, and that was fortunate, because he needed every advantage he could find tonight. The reason he had crossed that creek was folded in his breast pocket, inside an oilskin wrapper he had thought to tuck it into when he saw the clouds building that morning. It was a letter, and not just any letter. It had been delivered to his office 4 days ago by a courier from the Abilene Land Registry, addressed not to Lewis but to Inez, and Lewis had signed for it without thinking, and then he had read the return address, and then he had read the letter, and then he had sat down in his chair for a long time staring at the wall of his office, understanding exactly what it meant. The letter contained a certified copy of a prior deed transfer, dated 1878, in which a man named Caldwell Holt, Franklin Holt's deceased father, had purchased the mineral rights to the Sutton Hill property from Inez Sutton for $300. The surface rights had remained with Inez. But the mineral rights, which Inez had never known existed as a separate legal instrument, now legally belonged to Franklin Holt as sole heir to his father's estate, which meant that the oil surveyors who had come through Harlan County the previous summer, the 3 quiet men with their equipment and their notebooks whom Lewis had noticed and immediately forgotten, had not been forgotten by Franklin Holt. Lewis understood now, with the sick clarity of a man who had been slow when he should have been fast, that Holt did not want the land for ranching. He wanted it because someone had told him there was oil beneath the Sutton Hill property, and with the mineral rights already in his possession, he had only to remove Inez's surface rights claim through any means available, legal or otherwise, before she discovered what was beneath her land. But here was the thing that had sent Lewis Redmond out into the worst storm of the year on foot. There was a second document in the envelope from Abilene. It was a handwritten statement from a man named Owen Greer, a land agent in Abilene, who stated that he had been present in 1878 when the deed transfer was signed, and that Inez Sutton had been, in Owen Greer's professional opinion and direct observation, deeply intoxicated, that Franklin Holt's father Caldwell Holt had provided the liquor personally over the course of an afternoon, and that Inez Sutton had not understood what he was signing. Owen Greer was 71 years old, in poor health, and had written this statement because his doctor had told him in September that he would not see Christmas, and Owen Greer did not want to die with this particular thing on his conscience. He had sent the statement to the Abilene Registry with instructions to forward it to Inez Sutton, Inez Sutton's heir, at whatever address the registry had on file, which happened to be the Harlan County Sheriff's Office, because that was the address Inez had given when she filed her initial claim inquiry. So the letter had come to Lewis. And Lewis had held it for 4 days while the rains came, and while he understood what it meant, and while something in him, something he had been carefully not examining for 6 months, finally broke through the surface like water through limestone. He had to get to Inez tonight. Because the second thing that had arrived at his office today, not by mail but by a boy who had been paid $1 to deliver a folded paper from the direction of the Holt Ranch, was a notice of eviction, legal and properly formatted, signed by Judge Reinhold, ordering Inez Sutton to vacate the Sutton Hill property within 48 hours. She had moved into the farmhouse only 3 weeks ago, after finally convincing Judge Reinhold that she had right of occupancy as deed holder pending the full hearing, and now that occupancy was being revoked, and the 48 hours began at noon today. And if Inez received that notice without also having the letter from Owen Greer, she would have no idea that the ground she was standing on might be worth more money than Franklin Holt had ever dreamed of taking from her family. And she would have no reason to fight instead of surrender. Lewis crested the low hill and saw the farmhouse below him in the early dark, a single lamp burning in the front window like a signal fire, and he started down toward it faster than was entirely safe on wet ground in failing light, and he was thinking about how he was going to explain the 4 days he had held the letter, and he was not finding any explanation that was going to satisfy her, nor should it. He was 20 feet from the porch when the door opened. Inez Sutton stood in the doorway with a lamp in one hand, and what Lewis recognized as her father's old Spencer rifle in the other, held at a perfectly competent angle across her body. She was wearing a plain work dress and her dark hair was pinned up but coming loose on one side from whatever she had been doing, and she was looking at him with an expression that moved very rapidly through surprise to guarded assessment to something he could not yet name. "Lewis Redmond," she said, "you look like you swam here." "I crossed the creek," he said, stopping at the porch step. "The bridge is out." "I know the bridge is out," she said. "I watched it go from this window this afternoon. What I don't know is why the sheriff of Harlan County swam through a flooded creek after dark to stand on my porch dripping on my father's floorboards." "I have something to tell you," Lewis said. "And I have something to give you, and neither of those things could wait until morning." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp shifted slightly in her hand, throwing its light across her face, and Lewis saw that she was tired in the deep way that comes not from one bad night but from months of sustained, grinding effort against an opponent who has more resources and fewer scruples than you do. He had watched that tiredness accumulate and had not done what he could have done to relieve it, and standing there soaking wet with the thing that might change everything in his pocket, he felt the weight of his own failures settle on him with the cold authority of a judge. "Come in then," Inez said, "before you catch your death." The farmhouse was small and not yet fully settled into being a home again. Inez Sutton had let it go in the years before his death, and Inez had been working steadily on it for 3 weeks, and there was evidence of that work everywhere Lewis looked: a fresh plastered wall, a rehung door, clean curtains made from what looked like flour sacks dyed blue, a small potbelly stove that was doing heroic work against the October chill. She had made the place inhabitable by sheer force of will, the way she seemed to make everything happen. She set the rifle against the wall with the ease of someone who has never felt the need to make a show of putting a weapon down, and she gestured at the chair near the stove. "Sit. I'll get a towel." "Inez," Lewis said. She turned from the hallway. "I owe you an apology before I say anything else," he said. "I'm going to give it to you." And then I need you to read what's in this envelope. And then I need to tell you what else is happening, because there is a notice coming to this house that is designed to make you give up, and I need you to have the full truth before it arrives." She was very still for a moment. Then she came back into the room and stood across the small table from him, and she said, "You had better start talking, Lewis." He took the oilskin packet from his pocket. He set it on the table. He told her about the letter arriving 4 days ago. He told her about reading the return address and about reading the letter and about the 4 days between then and now. He did not soften any of it or shift the blame anywhere else, because she was not a woman who would be insulted by the truth, and he was not, he decided, a man who was going to keep failing her. She did not interrupt him. She picked up the packet when he was done, and she opened it with hands that were steady, which told him more about her composure than almost anything else could have. She read Owen Greer's statement first, slowly, and he watched her face as she read it, watched the color come up in her cheeks, and he recognized that what he was seeing was not grief, though grief was probably in there too. What he was primarily seeing was the anger of a person who has been fighting at a disadvantage and has just discovered that the disadvantage was manufactured. She set the statement down and read the certified copy of the mineral rights deed. She read it twice. Then she set both documents on the table and she looked at Lewis Redmond with an expression that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. 4 days, she said. Yes, he said. You had this for 4 days. I did. While I was up here fixing the roof, Lewis. While I was filing responses to Holt's motions through Judge Reinhold. While I was alone up here on this hill in the rain. Yes, he said. And there is something else I have to tell you, about 6 months ago. About Franklin Holt and the conversation he had with me 3 days after you arrived in Caldwell Falls. So he told her that too, about the offer and the federal position and the senator's favors and his own silence. He told it plainly, without decoration, and it was by far the hardest thing he had ever said in his life, harder than any confrontation he had ever walked into with a gun in his hand. Because the confrontation in this small, warm room was not about survival. It was about the far more terrifying question of what kind of man he had been, and whether he could be a different kind going forward. When he finished, Inez was quiet for so long that he heard the rain on the roof and the creak of the cottonwoods outside and the tick of the stove. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said at last. "What changed?" He reached into his coat and took out the eviction notice and laid it on the table beside the other documents. She read it. He saw her jaw tighten. 48 hours, she said. From noon today, so you have until noon day after tomorrow. But that is not what changed, Inez. The letter from Greer changed it. Reading that letter and understanding what Holt has been doing, what he did to your father, what he has been planning, and understanding that you have been fighting for 6 months with one hand tied behind your back because I was holding something that should have been in your hands the day it arrived, that changed it. He stopped. He looked at the table, and something else changed it. What else? She said. I have been lying to myself, Lewis said, about why I care what happens to you. I told myself it was duty and jurisdiction and a legal case I was building. That was true for about the first week. After that it was something else, and I was too proud or too frightened, I don't know which, to say so. The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the rain continued its conversation with the roof. Lewis Redmond, Inez said carefully, as if she were examining the name for hidden compartments. You swam through a flooded creek in the dark in October to bring me a letter and an apology and what sounds very much like a confession. I did, he said. You could have drowned. The thought occurred to me around the point where the water reached my collarbone, Lewis said. I kept going. Something shifted in her face, subtle and significant, the way a door shifts on a hinge before it fully opens. I'm very angry with you, she said. I know. The 4 days, the conversation with Holt, the way you have been watching this situation from a distance like it was a chess game and I was one of the pieces. I am genuinely, substantially angry about all of that. You should be, Lewis said. I'm not asking you not to be. But, she said, and that single word carried so much weight he felt it. You crossed the creek. He said nothing. She looked down at the documents on the table, at Owen Greer's dying confession, at the mineral rights deed, at the eviction notice that was meant to end this, and then she looked at Lewis again and she said, "All right. Set aside the rest of it for now. Tell me what we do with this information. Tell me how we fight Holt with what we have." And something in Lewis that had been clenched for a very long time released, because this was the conversation he had been trying to deserve, and she was letting him have it. He leaned forward. Owen Greer is alive. Barely, according to his letter, but he is alive. The statement he sent is powerful, but a living witness is more powerful. I need to get to Abilene and get a deposition taken by a proper notary before he dies. That means I need to leave tomorrow before first light. That is 4 days hard ride, Inez said. 3 if I push Cutter. But that is not the only thing. The mineral rights deed, the transfer from your father to Caldwell Holt, if Greer can testify that it was signed under duress by an intoxicated man, then the transfer may be voidable. That does not help you immediately with the eviction, but it fundamentally changes what Holt is actually trying to protect here. Oil, Inez said quietly. You read the deed more carefully than I expected. My father always said there was something wrong with the south pasture. The grass never grew right. He used to say the earth there smelled different. She looked at the table. He sold the mineral rights for $300 when he was drunk, and he never told me. He probably did not remember it clearly. Greer says Caldwell Holt spent months befriending your father, softening him up, waiting for the right opportunity. It was deliberate, and it was patient, and it was planned. Inez's expression did not break, but Lewis saw the grief in it, the particular grief of discovering that someone you love was victimized systematically, that their vulnerabilities were mapped and exploited by a man who called himself a neighbor. My father was a good man, she said. I believe that, Lewis said, and meant it. He drank too much after my mother died. He couldn't help it. He tried. She smoothed the statement with one finger, not looking at Lewis. Caldwell Holt used that. And now his son is using it again. The same family, the same land, the same strategy of patient exploitation. That is exactly what is happening, Lewis said. And that is why I needed you to know before the eviction notice arrived and before Holt's men came up here to enforce it. Because if you leave this property without knowing what is beneath it and what Greer's statement might mean in court, you might make a settlement that signs away something worth a great deal more than whatever Holt offers you. Inez stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the wet dark. Lewis stayed where he was, dripping quietly onto the floorboards, watching her think. He had seen a lot of people think in his line of work, and most people look small when they were thinking, drawn inward, reduced. Inez Sutton looked larger when she was thinking, as if the problem expanded her instead of diminishing her. There is a lawyer in San Antonio, she said. His name is Theodore Marsh. He handled my father's estate and he specializes in land law. He has been slow because I could not pay him quickly, but he is honest and he is thorough. If I telegraphed him tomorrow with the substance of Greer's statement, he might be able to file for an emergency stay of the eviction on the grounds that the original mineral rights transfer was fraudulent. That would require getting the telegram out, Lewis said, which means Caldwell Falls, which means the telegraph office, which is owned by a man who plays cards every Friday night with Franklin Holt. Henry Marsh at the telegraph office, Inez said, turning from the window. Yes, he would find a reason to delay it or report its contents before it arrived. But there is a Western Union in Brackett's Mill, 15 miles east, which is accessible tomorrow morning once the rain stops, Lewis said, which the sky to the northwest suggests it will by midnight. She looked at him with a small, considering expression. You checked the sky before you crossed the creek. I checked it and then I crossed the creek anyway, Lewis said, because the rain stopping by midnight does not help you if Holt's men arrive at first light with the eviction notice. She was quiet for another moment and then she said, You said you were lying to yourself about why you care what happens to me. The shift in the conversation was abrupt, but Lewis had known it was coming. He had left that opening and he had left it on purpose. "Yes," he said. "I am going to need you to be clearer about that," Inez said, "because I have been in this town for 6 months, and in that time the man I most needed to trust was also the man giving me the least reason to, and I would like to understand what I am actually dealing with before I decide how much to rely on him." Lewis Redmond looked at Inez Sutton and thought about all the various ways a person can be dishonest, the ways that have nothing to do with lying and everything to do with withholding. He had been a champion of that particular form of dishonesty for most of his adult life. "I care about you," he said, "not in the general way that a sheriff cares about the people in his county. Not in the charitable way that a person cares about someone in a difficult situation. In the specific way that I have thought about you every single day since you stepped off that stage and looked at Caldwell Falls like it was a problem you intended to solve. And I have thought about you in ways that have nothing to do with your property dispute or Franklin Holt or the law, and I have not been able to stop." The lamp burned. The rain drummed softly on the roof. "You have a very bad way of showing it," Inez said. "I know that," Lewis said. "Holding evidence for 4 days is not a love letter, Lewis." "No," he said, "it is not. And if I could take it back, I would take it back and I would give you the letter the morning it arrived, and I would tell you about Holt's offer to me at the same time, and I would stand in your way a great deal less than I have been standing in your way while telling myself I was being careful." She came back from the window and stood by the table again, and she looked at him for a long time. Lewis Redmond had been looked at by frightened people and angry people and desperate people and dangerous people, but he could not remember being looked at with quite this particular quality of attention, the attention of someone deciding something serious. "Get the towel yourself," she said at last. "Hallway, second door. There is a dry coat on the peg that was my father's. It will be too big, but it will be better than what you have on. And then we are going to sit down and plan this very carefully, because we have until noon day after tomorrow, and we are not going to waste a minute of it." He got the towel. The coat, when he found it, was heavy canvas, worn soft with years, and smelled faintly of cedar and something else he could not name, and it did fit him poorly across the shoulders, and he did not care in the slightest. He came back and sat down, and they laid the documents out between them, and Inez produced paper and a pencil and they began to work. They worked for 2 hours, planning with the thoroughness of people who understand that the details matter in ways that feel tedious until they do not. Who would ride to Brackett's Mill in the morning, and what the telegram to Theodore Marsh should say, and what it should not say. Because precision in a legal communication is the difference between a stay of proceedings and a delay of 2 weeks while the court asks for clarification. What Lewis would need in Abilene and how he should approach Owen Greer's current custodians, a niece named Prudence, according to Greer's letter, and how to get a certified deposition taken by a notary in a city where he knew no one. They argued twice. Once about whether Inez should remain at the property during the 48-hour window, with Lewis wanting her to go into town where he could have Tom Hadley, his deputy, keep an eye on things, and Inez pointing out with considerable force that leaving her own property on the strength of an illegitimate eviction notice was precisely the behavior Franklin Holt was hoping to prompt, and that yielding the physical ground before the legal ground was settled would be used against her in court. Lewis conceded this point because she was right. The second argument was about who rode to Brackett's Mill. Lewis wanted to send Tom Hadley. Inez wanted to go herself. They reached a compromise in which Inez would ride to Brackett's Mill, while Lewis remained at the property until she returned, which addressed both her refusal to be absent from the property and his unwillingness to leave before he was confident she was not facing Franklin Holt alone. Somewhere in the second hour, Inez made coffee. It was strong and black, and she handed him a cup without asking how he took it, and he took it without modification, and he drank it and felt the warmth of it travel all the way down and start to work on the cold that was still in his bones from the creek crossing. They were talking about the legal precedents for mineral rights fraud in Texas land cases, a subject that Inez had researched with the dedicated ferocity of a woman who does not have the money to pay a lawyer to do everything for her. When Lewis looked up from the notes she was making, and he said simply, without planning it, "I should have been doing this with you all along." Inez's pencil paused. "6 months of fighting this alone," Lewis said. "You never asked me to, or you asked and I found reasons to keep a distance. But I should have been here, Inez. I should have been on this side of the table from the start." She looked at the coffee cup in her hand. "I did wonder," she said, "whether you were bought, whether Holt had you completely." "He made the offer," Lewis said. "I didn't take it. But you didn't refuse it clearly enough to protect yourself from its influence," Inez said, and this was so precise and so accurate that Lewis had no response. "No," he said, "I didn't." "Why not?" He thought about this honestly. "Because refusing it clearly would have required me to commit fully to your side of this, and committing fully to your side of this required me to acknowledge something I was not ready to acknowledge. About you, about what you mean to me. And a man can avoid a great deal of personal reckoning by keeping a professional distance." Inez set down her coffee. "That is a remarkably honest answer." "I am trying," Lewis said, "to be as honest tonight as I should have been all along." She looked at him with that quality of attention again, that serious, comprehensive look. Then she said, "I am also going to tell you something honest. I noticed you from the first day. Not in the way that is flattering to you, which was the way you kept your distance, but in the way that a person notices when someone who should be an ally is holding something back. And that noticing became a kind of vigilance on my part, watching you for signs of whose side you were on. And underneath that vigilance, underneath the watching, was something I was also not entirely ready to acknowledge." Lewis said nothing. He waited. "You are not a dishonest man by nature," Inez said. "You are a man who got tangled in something and didn't know how to untangle it without losing something else. I understand that. I do not forgive it instantly, and I am not suggesting the last 4 days in particular are anything other than a serious failing. But I understand it." She paused. "And the creek," she said, almost to herself. "The creek," Lewis said. "A man who crosses a flooded creek in the dark in October to bring a letter he could have sent with his deputy in the morning. That man is telling you something about his priorities that the previous 6 months were obscuring." "I needed to tell you myself," Lewis said. "I needed you to hear it from me and see my face when I told you, so that you would know it was not going to happen again. A letter sent with Tom Hadley would not have served that purpose." "No," Inez said. "It would not have." The fire in the stove had burned down and the room was comfortable now with the warmth of it, and the rain had lightened, as Lewis had predicted, and the night outside had softened from a hammering to a murmur. Lewis became aware of how quiet it was inside the farmhouse, how close the lamplight made the walls, how this was perhaps the most honest conversation he had had with another person in years. "We should sleep," Inez said. "I need to leave for Brackett's Mill at first light, and you need to leave for Abilene at the same time." Lewis nodded. "I can sleep on the floor by the stove if you have a blanket." Inez gave him a look that was caught between amusement and something warmer. "There is a second bedroom. It is my father's room. The bed frame is sound and I have a quilt on it." She stood and picked up the lamp. "It is not a complicated offer, Lewis. It is October and you are not fully dry yet, and there is a bed." He took the bed. He lay in the dark in Inez Sutton's room under a heavy quilt, and he listened to the rain become gentle and eventually stop. And he thought about the creek crossing, and the letter, and the long conversation at the kitchen table. And he thought about Inez Sutton in the way he had been trying not to think about her for 6 months, fully and without the protective buffer of professional distance. And he understood, with the peaceful clarity of a man who has stopped fighting himself, that what he felt for her was not infatuation or circumstantial attraction, but something of the durable, structural variety, the kind that is built out of respect and honesty, and the specific intimacy of two people. Planning a difficult fight together at a kitchen table by lamplight. He slept better than he had in months. In the morning, they were up before the sun, moving through the small kitchen in the gray pre-light with the efficiency of people who have shared a common purpose and do not need to narrate it. Inez was already dressed when Lewis came out in a riding dress and boots, her dark hair braided back, and she had made oatmeal, which they ate standing at the kitchen counter because neither of them had time for the formality of chairs. "The telegram to Marsh," Inez said, going over the notes they had made the night before. "I will keep it concise. Greer's statement exists. Mineral rights transfer suspect, need emergency stay of eviction based on potential fraud. He will understand what to do. Tell him the 48 hours started at noon yesterday," Lewis said. "I will." "And Inez," he said. She looked at him over the notes. "If Holt's men arrive before I'm back, you do not engage with them alone. You let them deliver the notice, you accept it calmly. You tell them you are aware of the situation and that you are consulting your legal representative, and you do not let them pass the threshold of this door without a court order in their hand." "I am not afraid of Franklin Holt's hired men," Inez said. "I know you are not. I am saying that your composure and your legal correctness are your greatest weapons right now, and I need you to use them. Courage is important and composure is what wins the case." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "You are very good at your job when you are actually doing it," she said. "I mean that as a genuine observation, not a rebuke." "I'll take it as both," Lewis said. She almost smiled. It was not a full smile, but it was directed at him with something in it that had not been there 6 months ago, or even the night before. A softening, a specific and intentional warmth, and Lewis Redmond, who had faced gunfights without flinching, felt it more sharply than almost anything he could remember. They went outside together into the cool, wet, post-rain morning, the air smelling of earth and cedar and distant mountains, and Lewis retrieved Cutter from the cottonwood by the creek, which had dropped 6 inches overnight and would drop more as the day warmed. He and Inez rode together down the hill and then separated at the fork in the road, she heading east toward Brackett's Mill, he heading north toward the Abilene Road, and just before the fork Lewis drew Cutter up level with her horse, a steady gray mare named Patience, and he said, "I am going to come back with what we need." "I know you are," Inez said. She looked at him for a moment, at the weathered coat and the badge catching the early light and the face of a man who had just recently decided to stop running away from the most important thing in his life, and then she said, "Come back quickly, Lewis." He did. The ride to Abilene was 3 days on a good horse over relatively dry roads, and Lewis pushed Cutter as hard as he dared, stopping for water and rest at intervals that were sufficient for the horse and insufficient for Lewis's comfort, eating hardtack and dried beef from his saddlebag, sleeping in 4-hour stretches under the stars with his saddle for a pillow, rising before dawn and riding on. The landscape of West Texas shifted from the limestone scrub of Harlan County to the broader, flatter country north of the Concho, open and wind-scoured, and lonely in the way that Lewis had always found clarifying rather than depressing, the kind of landscape that removes everything unnecessary from a person's thinking. He thought about Inez constantly. Not with the anxious, blocked quality that had characterized his thinking about her for 6 months, but with the open, direct quality of a man who has finally looked at something honestly and found it does not destroy him to see it clearly. He thought about her composure and her competence and the way she had said, "Come back quickly, Lewis," in the same tone she might use for a task with a clear deadline, matter of fact and certain, as if his coming back was not in question and the only variable was the speed. He thought about what she had said, about noticing him from the first day, about the watching beneath which there was something she was not ready to acknowledge. He thought about the fact that she had offered him her father's bed without embarrassment, not as an intimacy but as a practical kindness, which in its own way was more intimate than most things. He arrived in Abilene on the evening of the third day, road-worn and squinting against the wind, and he found a hotel, asked the desk clerk for the address of the niece named Prudence who was caring for Owen Greer, and received a look of mild surprise, along with the information that Owen Greer was a well-known figure in Abilene, a retired land agent who had been respected for 40 years. Prudence Greer, Owen's niece, was a compact, severe woman of about 50 who opened the door of her modest house on Merchant Street and looked at Lewis's badge with the expression of someone who has been expecting trouble. He explained himself quickly and clearly, told her about the letter, about Inez Sutton, about Franklin Holt and the mineral rights and the eviction notice. Prudence Greer listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said, "My uncle has been trying to reach that woman for 2 months. The registry lost her address and then found it, and then the letter went off and he has been praying she received it. Come in." Owen Greer was in a back bedroom that had a quality of careful, loving maintenance about it, the room of someone who is being cared for with great attention and very limited hope. He was a thin man who had been large, and he had the particular brightness in his eyes that illness sometimes produces, a compensatory alertness. He took Lewis's hand with more strength than Lewis expected and said, "You're from Harlan County. Tell me about the woman." Lewis told him about Inez. He told him all of it, the arrival, the 6 months of legal struggle, the eviction notice, the plan with Theodore Marsh in San Antonio. Owen Greer listened with his eyes closed most of the time, nodding occasionally. "I want to make the deposition," Greer said when Lewis finished. "I want it done properly, with a notary, signed and witnessed. I want it to be the kind of document that cannot be argued away in court. I owe it to her father." He paused. "Inez Sutton was a good man. Caldwell Holt spent 2 months drinking with him before he got him to sign anything. I was a young man then, 30 years in the business, and I knew what I was looking at, and I said nothing. I told myself it was not my business. I have been telling myself that for years." He opened his eyes and looked at Lewis. "Get me the notary." Lewis got the notary. He spent the following morning in Owen Greer's bedroom with a notary named Elias Watkins, a careful and precise man who took the deposition word by word and had Greer sign each page with the labored determination of a man making sure this particular task is completed correctly. Lewis signed as a witness. Prudence Greer signed as a witness. It took most of the morning, and when it was finished, Owen Greer looked exhausted and satisfied in equal measure. "One more thing," Greer said. He gestured at a small wooden box on his dresser. "In there, an agreement. Caldwell Holt had it drawn up by a lawyer, a man named Whitfield who practiced in Abilene in those years. The agreement specifies the terms, the $300, the mineral rights transfer. Whitfield is dead, but his practice was taken over by a firm that still exists. If Holt tries to argue the deposition is fabricated, which he will, that agreement is the corroborating document that places me in that room on that day." Lewis opened the box. Inside was an original copy of the transfer agreement, 80 years old in paper terms and perfectly legible. Inez Sutton's signature at the bottom in the careful script of a man who had not been educated in elegance but had tried to be legible, and next to it Caldwell Holt's larger, more confident signature, and at the bottom as a witness, Owen Greer. "Take it," Greer said. "Take all of it. See that it gets to her." Lewis left Abilene the next morning with the notarized deposition, the original transfer agreement, and a separate letter from Owen Greer addressed personally to Inez, which Prudence had suggested, and which Owen had dictated to her and signed the previous evening. Lewis did not read the letter. He put it in the oilskin packet with the other documents and he rode south. In Caldwell Falls, while Lewis was riding hard for Abilene, things had been moving according to a logic of their own. Inez had sent the telegram to Theodore Marsh from Brackett's Mill on the morning after Lewis left, and Marsh, who was a better lawyer than his slowness suggested, had immediately grasped the implications and had filed for an emergency stay of the eviction with the 3rd District Court in San Antonio. bypassing Judge Reinhold entirely on the grounds that Reinhold had a demonstrated pattern of delay in this matter that constituted a failure of judicial function. This was a bold filing, and Marsh made it with the confidence of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of ammunition. Franklin Holt's men had arrived at the Sutton Hill property on the second day of the 48 hours. Two large and deliberately unhurried men, named Pike and Teague, who had presented the eviction notice with the practiced air of people accustomed to their physical presence doing half the work. Inez had accepted the notice through the partially open door, told them calmly that she was aware of the situation and was consulting her legal representative, and closed the door. Pike had knocked again and suggested that she might want to think carefully about her choices here, and Inez had opened the door again and looked at him with an expression so composed and so utterly unimpressed that Pike, according to the account he later gave, had felt unaccountably small, and they had left. Tom Hadley, Lewis's deputy, had ridden up to the property at noon and remained there for the rest of the day, not because Inez had asked him to, but because he had received a note from Lewis before Lewis's departure, asking him to ensure that whatever happened at the Sutton Hill property happened with a witness of the law present. Tom was a young deputy with a large mustache and a good heart, and he took up a position on the porch with his rifle across his knees and his hat pulled low and said very little, which was exactly the right choice. The emergency stay from the 3rd District Court arrived at Judge Reinhold's office by telegraph on the 3rd day, which was the day after the 48 hours expired, but which was also accompanied by a formal notice to Reinhold that the case had been escalated, and that any enforcement action taken prior to the 3rd District's review would be subject to contempt proceedings. Judge Reinhold, who was 60 and frightened and who had, underneath everything, enough remaining conscience to be relieved when someone else took the weight of this from him, immediately issued a stay of all enforcement actions in the case, and sent word to Franklin Holt's lawyer that the matter was now before the 3rd District. Franklin Holt, receiving this news, was not a man who lost his temper visibly. He was a man who sat very still and looked at his lawyer and said, very quietly, "Find out who went to Abilene." He found out within the day because Caldwell Falls was not a large community and Lewis Redmond's departure north was known. Inez learned about Holt's inquiry through Clara Voss, who still had Inez's trunk and some of her things at the boarding house, and who visited the Sutton Hill property on the 4th day with bread and information, in roughly equal measure. Clara was a practical and observant woman who had been running a boarding house in Caldwell Falls for 20 years, and who had watched Franklin Holt operate in this county, for most of that time, with the specific knowledge that comes from being furniture in a room where men talk freely because they do not think a woman running a boarding house is anything to worry about. "He knows Lewis went north," Clara told Inez, setting the bread on the table. "And his man Devereaux is asking around the telegraph office about messages from San Antonio." "Henry Marsh at the telegraph office," Inez said. "Henry is afraid of Holt," Clara said. "Always has been. But Henry is also a man with a record he doesn't want aired, a business matter from years ago that Holt knows about and has not yet chosen to use. Which means Henry is uncomfortable being told to monitor my friend's communications, because it moves the thing Holt has on him from theoretical to active." Inez looked at Clara with appreciation. "You know a great deal about the internal politics of Caldwell Falls." "I make breakfast for 11 people every morning," Clara said. "Men talk while they eat. I have been making breakfast in this town for 20 years. Does Henry Marsh know that the 3rd District stay has been filed? He delivered the telegraph of it to Judge Reinhold himself," Clara said. "He knows, and that means Holt knows within an hour. Then Holt knows that the legal strategy has shifted beyond Reinhold's control," Inez said, "which means whatever leverage he had over Reinhold is less useful." "Which means," Clara said carefully, that a man like Holt, who has operated through legal pressure and delay for months, might begin to think about other kinds of pressure. Inez was quiet for a moment. "You mean direct?" "I mean," Clara said, "that it would be good if Lewis came back soon." Lewis came back on the evening of the 6th day since his departure, trail-worn and dusty, with the specific look of a man who has been riding with urgency. And he came directly to the Sutton Hill property without stopping in town first. And when Inez heard the hoofbeats and went to the door, she saw him coming up the hill in the late afternoon light, and she felt something that she was not prepared for in the specific rush of it. A flooding relief that was entirely disproportionate to any reasonable professional concern, and she recognized it clearly for what it was and stood in the doorway and waited for him. Lewis came up to the porch and dismounted, and Cutter looked exactly as tired as Lewis did, and Lewis looked at Inez and said, "I have it, all of it. The deposition, the original agreement, a letter from Greer to you, and the corroborating document that ties the whole thing together." Inez said, "Come inside." And then, because the relief had broken through her composure in a way that surprised her, she said, "I am very glad you came back." Lewis looked at her. "Did something happen?" "Tell me what you brought first," she said. "Then I will tell you what happened while you were gone," he told her. They sat at the kitchen table that had become, Lewis realized, a familiar geography to him, a specific geography of two people working together, and he laid the documents out one by one. The notarized deposition with Owen Greer's signature on each page, the original transfer agreement, the personal letter. Inez picked up the personal letter last, and Lewis watched her read it, watched her face as Owen Greer's words, dictated to his niece in a back bedroom in Abilene with the careful attention of a dying man saying something important, reached her. She set the letter down and looked at the table for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "He says my father was kind to him. He says my father gave him a meal once when he was broke and traveling through, years before all of this. He says he never forgot it and he is sorry he let a man be done this way." She pressed her lips together briefly. "He asks me not to be angry at my father. He sounds like a good man who made a wrong choice," Lewis said, "and spent a lifetime knowing it." "Yes," Inez said. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "Now, while you were gone." And she told him about the stay, about the 3rd District, about Clara Voss's information, about Franklin Holt knowing that Lewis had gone to Abilene. Lewis was quiet for a moment, calculating. "He will know or he will suspect what I went to get. A deposition from Greer is the thing he most cannot afford. If Greer's testimony stands up before the 3rd District, the mineral rights transfer is voidable, and everything he has been doing in this county for the past year, the manipulation of Reinhold, the occupation of your property, the pressure, all of it becomes exposed as fraud and conspiracy." "Which makes him dangerous," Inez said. "Which makes him dangerous," Lewis agreed. Men like Franklin Holt do not become violent as a first choice, but they become violent when the legal route is closed and they have enough at stake. "Oil," Inez said. "Oil," Lewis said. "If the surveyors were right and there is a significant deposit under this land, we are not talking about a property dispute over 140 acres of grazing land. We are talking about money that would make Franklin Holt one of the wealthiest men in Texas." "Which is why he has been so persistent," Inez said. "It has never been about the land itself." "No," Lewis said. "And now he knows the legal path is closing. I need to send these documents to Theodore Marsh tonight, with a full letter explaining the provenance of each piece. I also need to speak to Tom Hadley and have him put a watch on this property, not just during the day." "And you?" Inez asked. "I am going to go and have a direct conversation with Franklin Holt," Lewis said. Inez looked at him sharply. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I make clear, plainly and without ambiguity, that I know the full extent of what he has been doing, that the evidence has been forwarded to the 3rd District, that any action taken against you or this property or me will be treated as obstruction of a state legal proceeding, which is a federal matter and well above my jurisdiction, but also above Holt's ability to manage quietly. Lewis paused. And the kind where I make clear that the offer he made me 6 months ago, which I did not report and should have, is something I am willing to put in a statement to the 3rd District as additional evidence of a conspiracy to obstruct justice, unless he withdraws his claim on your property entirely and settles this out of court. Inez stared at him. You are going to use the thing that embarrasses you most to put pressure on him. Yes, Lewis said. Lewis, that could cost you your badge. Possibly, Lewis said. Depending on how the 3rd District views a sheriff who received an improper approach from a party in an active case and did not report it immediately. But I believe I can argue that my subsequent actions, obtaining the deposition, forwarding the evidence, establishing a protective watch, constitute the kind of remediation that reduces the professional damage. He looked at her steadily. And I'm more interested in making sure you are safe and that your land is secure than I am in managing my reputation. Inez looked at him for a long time. Then she said, You are a frustrating man, Lewis Redmond. You do the wrong thing for months and then you do everything right all at once. I understand that frustration entirely, Lewis said. I am not actually frustrated, Inez said quietly. I am saying it in the way that people say one thing when they mean something else because the something else is harder to say in the open. What is the something else? Lewis asked. That I trust you, she said. Not blindly, not naively, but genuinely. And that is not a small thing for me, given what this county in the last 6 months have done to my instinct for trust. Lewis felt that land in him the way important things land, quietly and with weight. I will not betray it, he said. Whatever I have to do, I will not betray it again. I know, Inez said, and she said it with the sureness of someone who has looked at the evidence and reached a conclusion. Lewis rode to the Holt Ranch the following morning with his badge polished and his hat straight, looking exactly as official as he knew how to look, and he asked to see Franklin Holt and was made to wait 20 minutes in the front room of a large and ostentatious ranch house that told him everything about the kind of man who lived in it. The furniture was heavy and expensive and cold, chosen for display rather than comfort. The paintings on the walls were landscapes of places that were not Texas, as if Texas were not a place worth depicting. There was a massive fireplace and a mounted longhorn head above it, and the general atmosphere of a man who wanted you to know he had arrived. Franklin Holt came in at last, a man in his mid-50s, well-dressed, with silver hair and the kind of face that has learned to be pleasant because pleasantness is useful. He sat down across from Lewis without offering his hand and said, Sheriff, to what do I owe the visit? Lewis told him. He laid it out with the flat precision of an official communication, no warmth and no hostility. The deposition from Owen Greer, the original transfer agreement, the 3rd District filing, the letter he had already sent to Theodore Marsh, the personal statement he was prepared to make regarding the offer Holt had made him 6 months ago. Franklin Holt listened. His face did not change significantly during the recitation. He had the self-possession of a man who has spent decades in negotiations and does not give his reactions away cheaply. But Lewis watched his eyes, and Lewis had spent 11 years reading what was in people's eyes while their faces were telling other stories. And what he saw in Franklin Holt's eyes as the full extent of the situation became clear was not rage. It was the particular calculation of a man understanding that the odds have shifted against him and assessing his options with the same cold efficiency that had gotten him to this position in the first place. When Lewis finished, Holt said, That is a considerable amount of paper for what is essentially a property dispute between a dead man's estate and my family's legitimate interests. The paper exists, Lewis said, precisely because it is not a legitimate interest but a fraudulently acquired one. Owen Greer is a credible and disinterested witness who was present at the transfer and has made a sworn statement about the conditions under which it occurred. The 3rd District will take that seriously, Mr. Holt, because the 3rd District is not Judge Reinhold. A very small tightening around Holt's eyes at the name Reinhold. He had not expected Lewis to say that name so directly. "What are you proposing?" Holt said. "A full withdrawal," Lewis said, "of the eviction notice, of the claim to mineral rights on the Sutton Hill property on the grounds that the original transfer is voidable due to fraud. In exchange, I will not submit my personal statement regarding your approach to me 6 months ago to the 3rd District as part of the evidence package." "You would be acknowledging a professional failing on your own part," Holt said. "Yes," Lewis said. "I am willing to do that." Holt was quiet for a moment. Lewis waited. The fire in the Holt Ranch fireplace was large and expensive, like everything else in the room. "You are making this choice for a woman who has been in this county for 6 months, Holt said. "I am making this choice," Lewis said, "because it is the right thing to do. The woman in question is a factor in that, but the rightness of the thing does not depend on her." Holt looked at him with something that might have been genuine assessment. "You are a more principled man than I thought you were 6 months ago, Redmond." "I am trying to be the kind of man I should have been from the start," Lewis said. There was a long pause. Then Holt said, "Have your documents drawn up. I will have my lawyer review them." He stood. "For the record, Redmond, the surveys showed a limited deposit. The economics were marginal from the beginning. My father paid $300 for something that was likely never worth the effort." He paused at the fireplace, looking at the mounted longhorn. "Tell Miss Sutton the land is hers." Lewis left the Holt Ranch and rode back to Caldwell Falls with the low autumn sun at his back, and he stopped at his office and wrote out a full account of the negotiation for the 3rd District file, and he sent it with Tom Hadley, and then he rode up to the Sutton Hill property. The next weeks were legal formality, slow and careful and unglamorous, the kind of work that does not make good stories but makes lasting settlements. Theodore Marsh in San Antonio proved to be exactly the lawyer that Inez had needed all along, efficient and precise, and not afraid of men like Franklin Holt. And the 3rd District proceedings moved with a speed that astonished Reinhold and satisfied Marsh. The mineral rights transfer was voided on the basis of Owen Greer's deposition and the corroborating original agreement. The eviction notice was formally struck. The Sutton Hill property was confirmed in Inez Sutton's sole ownership, surface rights and mineral rights together. The actual oil question turned out to be, as Holt had suggested in his grudging final conversation with Lewis, marginal. A small survey commissioned by Inez the following spring, paid for partly by the settlement Theodore Marsh extracted from Holt in exchange for not pursuing the full fraud case, found a modest deposit that would provide a modest but meaningful annual income, enough to restore the farmhouse properly, enough to buy 3 new horses and expand the operation, enough to make the land not just survivable but genuinely sustainable. It was not a fortune. It was what Inez needed. Owen Greer died in December, 2 months after Lewis's visit, having made it just past Christmas in apparent defiance of his doctor's prediction, or perhaps because his conscience was clean at last. Inez received a brief note from Prudence informing her of his passing, and she sat with that note for a while in the kitchen of the Sutton Hill farmhouse, now properly weatherproofed and warm, and then she folded it away with the personal letter he had written her, and she kept both. Lewis and Inez began seeing each other in the way that 2 people begin seeing each other when they have been aware of each other for a long time, and the obstacles between them have finally been removed, and the honesty they have been withholding has finally been said. Which is to say that it was not dramatic in the way that the creek crossing was dramatic, but it was steady and warm and accumulative in a way that was better than drama. He came up to the property on his days off, which in the slow season after the legal proceedings were settled were more frequent than usual, and he helped with the repairs that Inez had been making methodically, the kind of physical, practical work that they both found satisfying in a way that was also, they both knew, about something beyond the work. There was a week in November when they rebuilt the fence along the south pasture together, and by the end of that week, something between them had settled into a new and different shape. He told her things about himself that he had not told anyone. About the years before Caldwell Falls, a marriage at 22 that had lasted 4 years and ended not in any dramatic event, but in the slow erosion of two people who had married for the wrong reasons and had the grace to part before they destroyed each other. About the 10 years he had spent afterward in a kind of deliberate, managed aloneness that he had been mistaking for self-sufficiency. About the way he had arrived in Harlan County 11 years ago on a deputy's salary and stayed because the land felt honest and the work felt necessary, and he had not had a better reason to go anywhere else. Inez told him about her own years in Fort Worth, where she had worked as a bookkeeper for a merchant supply company after leaving home at 18, determined to make her own living before deciding anything about the shape of her life. About the letter from her father's doctor that had brought her west, too late to see Elias before he died, but in time to discover what he had left her and what had already been taken. About what it was like to be a woman in a legal dispute, the specific way that courts and lawyers and opposing parties looked at her with the slightly confused expression of people encountering a variable they had not anticipated. "Holt did not expect me to know what I knew," Inez said once, in the early dark of a November evening on the porch, both of them in coats against the chill, the valley below going blue with last light. He expected a grieving woman who knew nothing about land law. He had done exactly what he expected to do 3 times before, on 3 other properties in 2 counties, and each time the person on the other side had either not understood what was happening or had not had the resources to fight it. "I know about the other cases," Lewis said. "I started looking into them when the picture became clearer. And 2 of the 3 are beyond the statute of limitations for fraud claims in Texas. The third is more recent." When the 3rd District sent Marsh's filing, they also sent a notice to a district attorney in Bexar County that there may be a pattern of conduct worth examining, which is a much larger problem for Franklin Holt than losing the Sutton Hill mineral rights, Inez said. "Considerably larger," Lewis said. "Will it go anywhere? It may. These things move slowly, but it has been noted and it has been filed and it is not going away." He paused. "The district attorney in Bexar County is a man named Carlton who is not frightened of anyone." Inez nodded. Then she said, "Good." It was in December, one evening by the stove after supper that Inez had made from a recipe that was clearly her father's in the sense of being robust and generous, and not particularly careful about proportions, that Lewis said what he had been building toward for weeks. He said it not with a prepared speech, but with the directness that he had decided was the only honest way to say anything to this particular woman. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "and I am going to ask you. But I want to say first, before I do, that I know what it means, what you would be committing to in this county and in this time, and I know that you have built a life here that is entirely your own, and that you fought for entirely on your own terms. And I am not asking you to set any of that aside. I am asking if there is a version of your life here that includes me in it permanently, and if that version is something you want." Inez looked at him across the small kitchen table that had been the site of so many significant conversations between them that it had taken on a kind of weight, a history. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Lewis, you crossed a flooded creek in the dark to tell me the truth. The answer is yes." He smiled, and it was the full kind of smile, not the careful, managed expression he used professionally, but the other one, the one she had been waiting months to see, and she leaned across the table, and he met her and they kissed for the first time, and it was the simplest and most honest thing either of them had done in a very long time. They were married in the spring of 1883, in the small white church in Caldwell Falls, in a ceremony that was conducted by the pastor, and attended by Tom Hadley and Clara Voss, and a dozen other people from the town who had been watching the situation with the particular invested attention of a small community where everyone knows everyone else's business and is, in the main, rooting for the good outcome. Clara made a cake that was extravagant by Caldwell Falls standards, and wept throughout the ceremony in a manner she described afterward as allergies. Tom Hadley stood up straight and looked at Lewis with the expression of a young man watching someone do something he admires and intends to learn from. Theodore Marsh sent a letter of congratulation from San Antonio, which arrived 2 days after the wedding and made Inez laugh. Franklin Holt was still in Caldwell Falls, which was a fact both Lewis and Inez had to navigate with the pragmatism of adults rather than the luxury of people who can simply remove what displeases them from their landscape. Holt was quieter now. The district attorney's inquiry in Bixar County had reached him, and his lawyer was keeping him well advised about the importance of impeccable behavior. He did not look at Lewis or Inez with anything Lewis could interpret as active threat. He looked at them with the expression of a man absorbing a defeat and recalibrating, which was not comfortable but was manageable. The Sutton Hill property bloomed that spring in the way that land does when it is cared for by someone who means to stay. Inez had planted a kitchen garden and expanded the south pasture fence and was running 8 cattle on the land by May. The modest oil income had been directed first to the structural repairs and then toward the animals in that order, with the kind of priority setting that Lewis had come to understand as characteristic of the way Inez thought about everything: function before appearance, foundation before embellishment. Lewis continued his work as sheriff. He had made his statement to the 3rd District about the conversation with Franklin Holt 6 months prior, as he had said he would, and the 3rd District had found, in a written assessment he received in February, that while the failure to report had been a procedural error, his subsequent remediation, the deposition trip, the evidence gathering, the negotiated settlement and formal documentation, constituted substantial mitigation, and that no action would be taken against his badge. He read this letter in his office, and then he rode up to the Sutton Hill property and told Inez, who said, "I told you it would be all right," in a tone that was equal parts satisfaction and the particular proprietary warmth of a person whose opinion has been vindicated. "You were confident," Lewis said. "I had looked at the evidence," Inez said. "That is what I do." Judge Reinhold retired in the fall of 1883, citing health reasons, which were real but which were also materially assisted by the 3rd District's formal letter noting his pattern of delay in the Sutton Hill case. His replacement was a man of 40 named Caldwell from Austin, who had not grown up in Harlan County and owed nothing to anyone in it, and whose appointment improved the quality of justice in the county in ways that Lewis and Inez were not the only people to notice. On a morning in late November of 1883, 1 year and 1 month after the night Lewis had crossed the flooded creek, Inez told him she was expecting. She told him at the kitchen table, the same table, and Lewis's expression went through several phases that she found necessary to document, including confusion, delight, and a brief period of very visible emotion that he attempted to manage and failed to manage entirely. "A boy or a girl, I don't know yet," she said, watching him with the particular fondness she had developed for his unguarded moments. "We have time to think about names." "A boy," Lewis said. "I think a boy." "You do not get to decide that," Inez said. "I know," Lewis said. "I am predicting." He was right, as it turned out, though Inez reminded him that one correct prediction does not constitute a general principle, and he agreed with this readily enough that she found it suspicious. The boy was born in August of 1884, in the farmhouse on the Sutton Hill property, delivered by Clara Voss, who had delivered half the babies in Caldwell Falls over 20 years, and who managed the event with the same practical competence she brought to everything. They named him Elias, for Inez's father. Lewis had suggested this without being asked, which was the thing that made Inez cry for the only time in the whole process, and Lewis had been equal parts alarmed and tender about it. Inez Redmond was a healthy and loud and interested child who from his earliest months had the quality of attention that Lewis recognized from his mother, the way of looking at things as if they are problems worth solving, except that in a small child this quality is applied to the problem of reaching things that are too far away, and the problem of why the dog does not want to play more than the dog wants to play. and Lewis found this application of his wife's intellectual temperament in their son to be one of the ongoing joys of his life. In the years that followed, the Sutton Hill property grew into something that Elias the Elder would have recognized as the thing he had always hoped for, which was a working, self-sustaining piece of land with a house that was warm in winter and a family that was whole. Lewis added to it with his income, and Inez ran it with her planning, and they argued about things the way two strong-minded and honest people argue, which is to say directly and without permanent damage, and they agreed about things that mattered, which is the more important characteristic of a marriage. The district attorney in Bexar County concluded his inquiry into Franklin Holt's prior property dealings in 1885. The two older cases were beyond statute, as Lewis had predicted, but the third, a mineral rights acquisition in Bexar County in 1880, was not, and Franklin Holt faced fraud charges in the spring of 1885. He was represented by expensive lawyers, and the proceedings were long, but at the end of them, he was convicted of one count of fraud in the obtaining of a deed transfer by false pretense, fined heavily, and his other property holdings were subjected to a review that kept his lawyers busy for 2 more years, and his attention well away from Harlan County. It was not the total accounting that a certain kind of story would provide, but it was the kind of partial accounting that reality provides, and Inez, who was a realistic person, found it sufficient. She told Lewis about the verdict on the evening the news arrived, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your father." "Yes," Inez said, "something like justice for it, not the whole of it, but something." Owen Greer's statement made it possible, Lewis said. Owen Greer's conscience made it possible, Inez said, and you making the trip to Abilene. And you not giving up, Lewis said. For 6 months and then some you did not give up. I had a reason to stay, Inez said. She looked at Lewis across the kitchen table with the full warmth she no longer had any reason to guard. Several reasons, and then one very good one swam across a creek. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they sat in the warmth of the kitchen that had been her father's and was now theirs, listening to the sound of their son making the various sounds of a healthy small person sleeping nearby. And outside the fall of a Texas evening came down gentle and golden over the Sutton Hill property, over the mended fence and the expanded pasture, and the kitchen garden put to bed for winter, over the land that had been taken and reclaimed, and made into something that would carry them forward. Lewis Redmond, who had worn a badge for more than 15 years by then, and had known a great deal about human nature and not enough about his own, looked at his wife and his home and his son sleeping in the next room, and understood that the best thing he had ever done was cross that creek. Not because it had rescued Inez, who did not need rescuing and would have found another way to fight and would have, eventually, with or without him, won, but because crossing the creek was the moment he stopped holding back and started being fully, honestly present in the life that was in front of him. It was the moment he chose, in the most physical and concrete way available to him, to stop managing his distance and close it. She had called him weathered once, in the way that Clara Voss had described him to someone else, and the description had reached Inez. And Inez had told Lewis with a certain affection that weathered was the right word for a man who had been out in the elements of his own life for long enough to show it. He had not taken it as a criticism. A thing that has been weathered has been tested and has held. He chose to take it that way. In the spring of 1886, Inez told Lewis she was expecting again. This time she told him at the kitchen table with more equanimity than the first announcement, because they were people who had been doing this together for some time and had found their footing, and Lewis received the news with the same delight and slightly less visible emotional disarray. "Your prediction this time?" Inez asked. "A girl," Lewis said, "to balance things. I told you that you do not get to decide that." "I know," he said. "I am predicting." He was right again, which Inez announced with such pointed resignation that Tom Hadley, who was there for supper that evening and heard the exchange, laughed until Clara Voss, who was also there, told him to compose himself. The girl was born in November, dark-haired and serious in the way of newborns who have not yet decided what to make of things, and they named her Ada, which had been the name of Lewis's mother, and Inez had suggested it without being asked, which was the thing that undid Lewis entirely and which he managed somewhat better than the first time, which Inez noted with approval. Elias, 2 years old and full of opinions, inspected his sister with the concentrated attention of a scientist examining a new specimen, and then looked at Lewis and said, "Loud," which was the most accurate observation anyone made about Ada Redmond in her first year of life, and the family laughed together in the warm kitchen of the Sutton Hill farmhouse, on the land that had been fought for and reclaimed, the laughter rising up into the rafters and the evening air, and settling into the walls the way that the things that matter most do settle, becoming part of the structure itself. Lewis was sheriff of Harlan County for 7 more years after that, until 1893, when he chose not to seek re-election on the grounds that Tom Hadley had by then become an excellent officer, and the county would be well served by him, and on the further grounds that Lewis's family needed more of him than the badge allowed. He made this decision quietly and without drama and told Inez on a November morning very like the November morning of a decade before, the light slanting low and gold across the kitchen table, the children in the next room, the land outside cold and clear and theirs. Inez said, "Are you sure?" "Yes," Lewis said. "It has been your life for a long time," she said. "So have you," Lewis said. "So have they. That is a longer life and a better one." She looked at him for a moment with the comprehensive, honest attention that he had loved in her from the very beginning. Then she said, "All right then, we have more fence to build." He laughed. "We do," he said. "And Elias will want to help," she said, "which will make it take twice as long." "He will also want to explain to us how to do it better," Lewis said. "Exactly like his mother," Lewis said. "Be careful," Inez said. "I meant it with complete admiration," Lewis said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, a mirror of a gesture he had made to her years before, and they sat in the morning warmth of the kitchen with the wide Texas sky opening up outside the window, clear and cold and enormous, and the life they had built between them, through honesty and stubbornness and one very significant creek crossing, was solid and warm and entirely, enduringly theirs. The creek, when it ran high in the October rains, which it still did every year, could be heard faintly from the Sutton Hill property on quiet evenings, a low rush of sound across the distance, and Lewis would sometimes stand on the porch and listen to it, and Inez, coming to find him, would stand beside him, and they would both know what the other was thinking, and neither of them needed to say it, which was its own kind of language. The language that belongs exclusively to the people who have crossed the hard things together and come out on the other side. He had crossed the creek for her. He had done it before he fully understood everything it meant, driven by something truer and more urgent than full understanding, and it had brought him, stepping wet and shaking up onto the opposite bank in the last red light of an October day, not just to her door but to the life he had not known he was capable of. And she had opened the door. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was everything.